Hi everyone, welcome to a new installment of our department's research seminar. This is March 29, 2021. It's a beautiful weather in Bucharest, Romania, and we're delighted to host another session of our research seminar. This is hosted and organized by the Department of Theoretical Philosophy of the University of Bucharest, jointly with CELFIS. This is the Center for the Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science of the University of Bucharest. And we're incredibly grateful for sponsorship from our local public funding agency, and that will be via a project whose code is PN-3 Roman P1 1 BD 2019-0535. And once again, thanks so much to Reframing for their sponsorship. And tonight we have a fantastic topic that we're going to debate, and this will be in the metaphysics of time. And I believe that Bogdan Dumitrescu, who's our speaker tonight, is going to talk to us about, quote, metaphysics of time and freedom, comments on Karl Hoefer's inside-out perspective. Before I give the floor to Bogdan, let me just mention that I'm terrifically grateful that Bogdan is presenting what seems to be a centerpiece in his doctoral research, and we're very grateful for that. And he'll be delivering another talk at the Research Institute of the University of Bucharest, and this will be June 9th at 5 p.m. local time, called Eternalism, Time Travel, and Lodovichian Compatibility, a defense of David Lewis's response to the grandfather paradox. So be sure to stay tuned for that as well. That said, and without further ado, Bogdan, take it away, and thanks.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Andrei. Just a second so I could present my screen. Okay. 1 second, please. Okay. This should be it. Okay. Tell me, please, if you see the presentation, if you see the PowerPoint.
Yes, we can.
We do, yeah.
Right. Should I put it full screen so you could see it better?
That'd be fantastic.
All right. Just a second. Okay, is it full screen now?
Or yes. Yes,
okay,
it's good.
Super. Cool. So, right, just as Andrei very generously mentioned at the beginning, and I'm grateful that he did, my presentation today is titled Metaphysics of Time and Freedom, Comments on Karl Hoefer's Inside-Out Perspective. And what I wish to do with this talk is basically to present a certain compatibilist account that was proposed by Professor Karl Hoefer in 2002, and it's a quite different compatibilistic account than what we are used to hearing in the free will literature, because compatibilism in the free will literature is usually viewed as the thesis that free will freedom is compatible with the thesis of determinism. Well, this sort of compatibilist account by Karl Hoefer is quite different because it envisions an account in which a certain theory of time, namely eternalism or the block universe, is compatible with freedom. And generally speaking, this theory of time called eternalism is thought to entail fatalism, and thus it would seem that eternalism would entail a denial of free will. Now, so this is a different way of framing the problem of free will. But without further ado, let's just go to an overview of the talk. So in the first part of the talk, I will focus a bit on the old consequence argument for incompatibilism. and then show how Mr. Hoffer views the problem of free will and reframes it in order to make free will um, have actually more to do with how we conceive time than with determinism itself. So, and then in the second part, I'll present a bit of Hoffer's perspective called Freedom in the Block Universe or Freedom from the Inside Out. Then I will present two lines of criticism that were given towards Hoffer. Then in the third part, I will talk a bit about Mctaggart's distinction between two types of ordering of events in time called A series and B series. More on that later. And then a bit of a crash course on the metaphysical theories of time in order uh, to make sure that the viewers are acquainted with the main metaphysical theories of time. And right at the end, I will talk about my own comments on Hoffer's perspective. My thesis would be that Hoffer's perspective, although it purports to be compatibilistic, meaning that it wants to make the theory of time called eternalist compatible with freedom, I argue that he does not address the problem of ontological fatalism. So I will describe what ontological fatalism means right when I reach that certain part. Right. So, what is the consequence argument for incompatibilism? So, we know that in the old free will debate, there are two positions, two very prominent positions called compatibilism and incompatibilism. So, compatibilism is the thesis that free will and determinism are compatible. In a world in which determinism reigns supreme, well, we may still be free. But incompatibilists argue that the two concepts are not compatible, right? If free will, the existence of free will, would entail the denial of determinism, and the truth of determinism would entail the denial of freedom. Okay, so what is the main argument for incompatibilism? Let's see how it sounds. The most the best articulation for the for the consequence argument for incompatibilism was given by Peter van Eenwagen in an essay on free will and in an article called The Incompatibility Between Free Will and Determinism. So is this very simple argument stated? So Eenwagen says that if determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born. And neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. I add, uh, in order to make the argument clearer, that if the consequences of the past, in conjunction with the laws of nature, are our present actions, then our present actions are not up to us. If our present actions are not up to us, then we do not have free will. Therefore, if determinism is true, then we do not have free will. So this is the standard incompatibilist argument. Right. Okay. So there were many attempts in the literature to argue against von Inwagen's incompatibilist argument, the consequence argument. But I wish to focus on, well, one main strategy of making this, of arguing against this position. So there are two prominent attempts at combating the consequence argument. Some authors have tried denying premise 3, the premise that the laws of nature are not up to us. And well, David Lewis is one of these authors, and also philosophers that are humanists about laws, meaning that the laws don't actually necessitate how things are, but the laws are actually contingent generalizations of that describe the patterns of events in the world, right? That is humanism about laws. But what I am concerned with is the denial of premise 2. It is not up to us what went on in the past, meaning that if I were to deny this premise, I would say something like, well, It is, in a sense, up to me what went on in the past. And authors which deny this premise are Hoefer, Peter Forrest, and let's say Horwich in a book called The Asymmetries of Time. Now, obviously, my focus now is on Hoefer's account. Hoefer can deny this premise because under bidirectional determinism, which means determinism that determines later states and also earlier states of the universe in the same manner, under bidirectional determinism, my actions in the present logically entail past time slices just as much as they entail future slices. So that Huffer would argue that, in a sense, I am like a fundamental determiner. I am now uh, speaking to you, obviously, and this, under bidirectional determinism, my action is also influencing or constraining how earlier states could be, and also how earlier states of the world can be, right? More on this in a minute, because this is actually the truck of Hoffer's perspective, of Hoffer's compatibilist account of eternalism. Okay, so reframing the problem of free will. So let's focus on these two uh, statements of determinism. So Hoffer stated once that the thesis of determinism is kind of like this. The world is deterministic if and only if, given a specified way things are at the time t, together with the laws of nature, jointly, logical, mathematically determine a single possible future of the world. And another author, who is a humanist about laws, Esfield, from 2019, says something like this. So the propositions stating the laws of nature and the propositions describing the state of the world at an arbitrary time, i.e., the propositions describing the initial conditions, entail the propositions describing the state of the world at any other time. Thus formulated, it is clear that determinism in science is only about entailment among propositions. Now, we can see that there is a difference between these two definitions of determinism. One is that one of them has temporal notions, employs temporal notions. So a temporal definition of determinism would be like this. Actual past events and the laws of nature imply actual present or future events. Now, a definition of determinism that does not employ temporal terms would be something like this. State of the world X and the laws of nature imply state of the world Y. And, well, although determinism is often presented as this temporal definition, many authors such as Inwagen and Ehrman and Hofer himself choose to present determinism without employing temporal terms. And just before moving to the next section, the concept of free will that I have in mind right now in the discussion of this, in this talk, I understand freedom by Inwagen's idea that freedom is the power or ability of agents to act otherwise than how they in fact do. Okay, we'll see how all of this comes together in Hoffer's perspective. So Hoffer's perspective focuses on free will's relationship with time rather than determinism. He says that given a proper understanding of time, we will see that freedom and determinism are compatible in a much more robust sense than has ever been thought possible. He alludes to Mctaggart's distinction of the two time series. So Mctaggart was a philosopher from the beginning of the 20th century, and he was mostly a Hegelian, and he employed this distinction. He came up with this distinction between two kinds of orderings of events in time. These two determinations became very influent, and right now have been developed as full-blooded theories in the philosophy of time, in the analytic philosophy of time. So we're talking about A series time and B series time. Huffer describes A series time as like this. There is the past, there is the present, the now, and the future. The past is fixed, the present moves towards the future, and the future is open in some loose sense. Now, I argue that Hoffer's characterization of the A series is problematic here, but more on that in a minute when I get to the metaphysical theories of time. And what is the B series? B series is sort of like a linear ordering of events in which no single event can be distinguished as being now. Change exists in the B series, right? Because one thing can have different properties at different times. But time does not move as it does in the A series. It is static. So A series time is dynamic. We have a present that moves through the events of time with an unreal future and a fixed past. And in B series time, we don't have such movement. Nothing actually moves. We have a static theory of time. So, depending on the event we choose to focus on, we can classify the other events as being either earlier than, simultaneous with, I forgot to add that, and later than. So, very roughly, in A series time, we have events that are past, present, and future. And in B series time, we have relations, not properties of events. We have relations called earlier than, simultaneous with, and later than. B series time is like a calendar, right? And A series time is like the common sense view of time that we have in our perception, let's say. Okay, how are these two distinctions relevant in Hoffer's perspective? Well, he said that the conflict that we see with free will is because we unconsciously assume the A series time. We worry that a past state of the world or time slice will determine our present actions. But he says that if we adopt a B series, then it would seem that free will is secured. And why does he say this? He says that the very timelessness of the 4D block, sorry, in a B series, not in an A series, I'm sorry, leaves us free to reject the customary view that past events determine present choices. From the B series perspective, there is no reason to think of past future determination as more important or real than future past determination. Because on the B series perspective, remember, we're not dealing with actual with a fixed past, a moving present, and an unreal future. There is no fixed past plus the laws that entail our present actions, right? On the B series, earlier state plus the laws can entail our present actions, but also later states plus the laws can entail our present actions, right? However, in this B series perspective, Hoffer states that even more to the point, one can equally view a set of events in the middle as determiners of both past and future events, meaning that my action right now in the block universe, let's say I am within these two lines, my action right now sends ripples in the fabric of space-time, right? And it sends ripples also in the later states, in the later stages of the world, and also in the earlier stages of the world. See? So, the idea here is that if we assume A series time like we normally do, then we think that the past plus the laws determines our actions right now. Um, so that means that A series time privileges past future determination. Now, Hoffer thinks that this is actually why we think that there is a conflict between free will and deterministic physics, because there is a privileged direction of determination from past to future. But he says, oh, if we accept B series time or the B theory of time, a 4D block universe static eternalist theory, in which time is like this, well then, there is no such thing as a privileged past to future determination, meaning that we could view ourselves as being like this, sandwiched in the middle of the block universe, with our actions also influencing earlier states and later states. All right, so he says, however, if we accept B series time, we must adopt the block universe, a description of the world inspired by Einstein-Minkowski spacetime that consists of three spatial dimensions and one temporal dimension with an earlier-later ordering of events. All right, so Huffer says, let's accept this view of time rather than an A-series view of time. Okay, so Huffer says that the idea of freedom from the inside out is this. We are perfectly justified in viewing our own actions, not as determined by the past, nor as determined by the future, but rather simply as determined by ourselves, by our own wills. In other words, they need not be viewed as caused or explained by the physical states of other vast regions of the black universe. Instead, we can view our own actions, qua physical events, as primary explainers, determining in a very partial way physical events outside ourselves to the past and the future of our actions in the block. All right. Uh, Now, if you'll excuse me, I want to ask how much time do I have because I can't see I only have my screen of the presentation right now.
Bogdan,
Um,
it's entirely up to you, but we're counting on your good omens. So perhaps if you still have maybe 20 minutes or half an hour to go, would that be fine?
Half an hour would be okay. Half an hour would be
Okay,
okay.
perfect. Or even slightly more. The pace is the one that the topics at hand and your approach set.
All right. Thank you very much then. All right. I'll try to condense this in half an hour. All right. So, Uh, so this author, this philosopher, Jason Brennan, wrote a very short but very, very sharp article concerning Hoffer's perspective. So he has two lines of criticism, and I represented the criticism in I fashioned it into a dialogue so that it would be more, more dynamic, let's say. So Brennan has two lines of criticism to Hoffer's perspective. One is called the asymmetry in macroscopic efficacy. So he says that Hoffer may have shown that bidirectional determinism is not the threat to free will, but he has not shown that causation isn't a threat to free will. Why is it that our actions have a pervasive causal role towards later times and not equally well towards earlier times? So it's clear that on Huffer's perspective, on the eternalist block, bidirectional determinism holds. So determinism determines both later states and earlier states in the same manner. No privileged past to future determination. All right, but Hoffer also recognizes that causation is unidirectional, that it is asymmetric, and that this is due to, well, possibly the second law of thermodynamics, possibly entropy. Okay, so Brennan would ask Hoffer, why is it that our actions have a pervasive causal role towards later times and not equally well towards earlier times? Hoffer says this is so because causality is unidirectional. Brennan would ask, and why this asymmetry? Well, this causal asymmetry is due to the thermodynamic asymmetry. Entropy only goes one direction, you know. The amount of entropy in a closed system only increases and never decreases. Brennan, and how is the unidirectionality not a problem for free will? If all my actions are causally necessitated by antecedent events, then aren't my actions unfree? If you think that universal asymmetric causation is not a threat to free will, then you must explain why. If you think that it is a threat to free will, then your inside out perspective becomes irrelevant to the problem of free will, right? So apparently, Brenner would argue that Hofer, by keeping the asymmetric causation relation in the block universe, actually doesn't avoid the threat to free will. Okay, so Brennan would propose that in order to save your theory, Hofer, I suggest that you posit that we have a symmetric efficacy both towards later time slices and earlier time slices. And Hofer would say something like, no, no, efficacy is a causal notion. And if we say it's symmetric, then we must accept ridiculous backward causation. Me having eggs for breakfast today does not change the fact that I had bacon yesterday. Causal relations are asymmetric and metaphysical. Deterministic relations are simply logical entailments and only place constraints on how earlier states and later states can be. So, in Hoffer's perspective, causal relations that are asymmetric, in fact, all causal relations should be asymmetric here, um, does not imply obviously that there is backward causation. I mean, bidirectional determinism does not imply that we have backward causation if my actions right now in the block influence how earlier states can be. Because deterministic relations, as Hoefer says in a 2004 article, are simply logical entailments and place constraints on how earlier states can be. I don't have a causal influence towards the past. My action in the present right now only determines how the past can be, meaning that right now that I'm holding this conference, that I'm holding this talk at this conference, well, it determines how the past can be because firstly, I would have to have bought this laptop before, and I would have had to have made these slides before. I would have had to talk with the organizers of this conference before. This conference had to have existed. The project had to have existed, and so on. So, in this sense, my action in the present places constraints. And those are logical constraints on how earlier states can be. We're not talking about backward causation here. Causation remains asymmetric. That's what Hoefer would say. So Brennan would say something like, you have not given me good reasons to reject this symmetric efficacy given your basic premises. Also, if you say that we have little influence over the past because our choices determine a very small region of space-time and those constraints on how the past could be are trivial, then it should say the same thing about the future. Your freedom from the inside out is freedom to do very little. Right. So another line of criticism from Brennan would be this: the brute factor of random occurrence problem. Huffer says that we should take our choices in the block universe as basic fundamental determiners. And Brennan would say something like, this sounds like you are conceiving agents as uncaused causers. This move inherits the problems of indeterminism. Our actions in the block then are either random occurrences or unexplainable brute facts. A basic platitude about freedom of the will is that the agent causes the action. Because, and Hoffer would say, because bidirectional determinism in the block universe does not privilege past and future determinism, we can conceive our actions as not being determined by other time slices, but simply determined by our own wills. So this is just a restatement of his compatibilist account. Brennan would probably say something like this: this sounds like agent causation. If it is so, then haven't you shown that agent causation was the solution to free will all along? Your inside out perspective seems irrelevant again. All right. Well, in order to uh, make the pace a bit faster right now, I will
Bogdan,
say,
actually, no need. If you'd very much like to delve into some of these issues, by all means, please go ahead.
well, all right then. Thank you, Andre. Um, so I said in the beginning of the presentation, before presenting Hoffer's perspective, that I think that Hoffer's presentation of the A series time is characterization of A series time is problematic here. Why do I say this? This is the part where I come in and say that Hoffer's perspective has other problems that Brennan has not noticed. So going back to Mctaggart's distinction of the two times, we have A series time in which obviously we have past, now, and future. Events have properties, past, present, or future. These properties change in time. And B series time in which obviously we have only permanent relations, earlier than simultaneous with later than. The problem is how that Hoffer presented the A series time as a fully fledged theory on its own. This is not the case. This was not the case in Mctaggart's time. Mctaggart's article called "The Unreality of Time" simply simply came up with two determinations of positions of events in time. They were not fully fledged theories at that time. So there's no idea in Mctaggart that the past is fixed, that the present is now moving, or rather, no, there is this idea in Mctaggart's ordering that the present is now moving, because to Mctaggart, the only genuine change is change from past to present to future. So the flowing now is that which uh, is that which secures genuine change on Mctaggart's account, right? But there is no mention of a fixed past or of an open future, right? On Mctaggart's ordering. There, actually, Huffer is describing a certain A theory of time, a certain variation of the A theory of time when he presents A series, and I will get to it in a minute. So, a small crash course on the metaphysical theories of time. So, firstly, there would be the static B theory, classical eternalism, static block, past, present, and future events are equally real and existing. Dynamic B theory would be something called a growing block. I will I will expand on that in a moment. And static A theory would be something like the moving spotlight theory. And dynamic A theory would be classical presentism, the idea that only present events exist. Now, what's the difference between dynamic and static? Well, these are theses about existence in the metaphysics of time, because dynamicity presupposes that existence is time relative, meaning that right now, if I am in the objective present, well, then there is no such thing as, I don't know, the end of this conference, right? The end of this conference does not exist yet, or tomorrow does not exist yet. Uh, the cake that I intend to bake tomorrow does not exist yet on a dynamic theory of time. But on a static theory of time, the cake that I intend to bake tomorrow probably exists, right? Okay, so glad we have this out of the way. So, eternalism versus presentism, very fast. What is eternalism and what is presentism? Eternalism is the idea that all events, past, present, or future, are equally real and exist timelessly. Or minimally, it is the thesis that at least some non-present entities, facts, exist. Static time means that there is no passage of time or moving now. Okay, eternalism is often contrasted with its rival theory, presentism. Presentism is the idea that all events that exist are present events. No non-present events exist. Right, so dynamic time, as I said, is the idea that there is an objective privileged present moment that makes the passage of time possible. So, one could ask a present as an eternalist the following question. What truth value does the statement, there are no dinosaurs, have? This is a question that this is an example by Chrissy Miller in 2013. So the eternalist would say that, oh, the proposition there are no dinosaurs is true simpliciter. You wouldn't say that there is no Spain just because it doesn't exist here, right? Why say that there are no dinosaurs just because they don't exist now? And the presentist would obviously say this proposition is false. Dinosaurs have existed. If somebody had uttered the statement back when dinosaurs existed, then the statement would have been true. Now, if I uttered it, it would be false because dinosaurs just don't exist anymore. Obviously, we have a case of unrestricted versus restricted quantification here. The presentist has the quantification restricted to present events, and the eternalist has an unrestricted quantification of events. Oh, in the domain. Okay, so very fast. Eternalism versus free will. What was the problem? Why did Hoffer come up with this compatibilist account? Well, uh, the idea is, can you bring an event into existence on a static eternalist B theory of time? Well, it turns out that you can't really, because nothing gets brought into existence, really, on a static eternalist B theory. I mean, everything is causally necessitated, just like on this line, and exists, and every event exists, well, eternally on this static theory, right? Okay, another question would be, do you have dual ability? Meaning, do you have the ability to act otherwise on a static eternalist B theory? Well, this question would presuppose that we have something like a road. We have a forking road analogy. And on eternalism, it appears as you see here, we don't have any forking road. So prima facie, it would seem that we don't have any free will on an eternalist theory of time. This is more like a Parmenidean theory of time, like similar to Parmenides' ideas from ancient philosophy, obviously. Okay, here's a variation of the B theory. Here's a combination of the B theory with A theory, called the moving spotlight theory. The theory combines eternalism with objective becoming. Only one time is absolutely present. That time and only that time glows with a special metaphysical status. So obviously we have the line over here. We have the ordering of events, like we have in eternalism, but right here in 2021, I highlighted this year because this should be the present, the present moment in which we all live right now. So basically, what the moving spotlight theory does is add the present, add a privileged present to the B theory. Okay, but the add-on of an objective present does not change the fact that future events exist on a par with past and present events. So it seems that we are fatalistic on the moving spotlight theory as well. Presentism, the the standard A theory of time. According to presentists, only the present moment is ontologically real, and past and future locations are ontologically unreal, right? We have an unreal past, and we have an unreal future, but we only have a real present, right? So presentism entails that there exists an objective present, right? But it need not entail, however, that there exists an open future. This is a separate discussion, obviously. But it doesn't entail an open future, and it does not entail a closed future. Anyway, the future can be either closed or open on presentism, right? So here is the variation of the A theory that I think Huffer had in mind when he presented the A series time, because he said that the past is fixed on A series time, the present moves, and the future is unreal. Well, this is actually the description of the growing block theory that was suggested by C.D. Broad. On this model, there exists a single four-dimensional trunk that contains all of the temporal locations in the objective past, and at the very edge of the trunk is the objective present, which peers into nothingness, since no temporal locations are ontologically real. So we have a real past, right here, highlighted with red, and the real present, still here, but we have an unreal future. So the progression of the present is actually the adding of new time slices or time slices of existence getting added on the growing block, right? This is the A theory growing block theory, okay? So this is the theory actually that Hoefer had in mind. So trying to steelman Hoefer's argument, on an A series growing block theory, we would have the fixed past in conjunction with the laws of nature that would entail a singular future, right? So just imagine these two lines over here do not exist, and only one single line exists. All right, the future may be unreal, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily open on a growing block theory. Okay, so finally, the branching theory. The branching theory is one that actually implies an open future, right? So on the branching universe model, there exists a single four-dimensional trunk that contains all the temporal dimension locations in the objective past. The objective present lies at the end of that trunk, peering to an array of non-actual but ontologically real future branches, right? So we have, just like we have on the growing block theory, we have a real past with a real present that moves, right? But we have also real futures that are also non-actual. So this is a very interesting distinction. This is a very Meinongian distinction over here, because we have the distinction between subsistence and existence. So on a branching theory, the real past and the present exists, right? But the future branches only subsist. They are non-actual, but nevertheless they are there. Okay. Anyhow, now we are approaching the final part of my presentation, of my very lengthy presentation, unfortunately. So what do I mean by the idea that Huffer has not addressed the ontological fatalism problem. So, what is ontological fatalism? Now, if eternalism is true, then ontological fatalism seems to follow. Ontological fatalism is a sort of fatalism that stems from the nature of events themselves. So, if I'm in an eternalist growing block, if I'm on an eternalist static block theory of time, then later events also exist, right? It just so happens that my existence is simultaneous with this event right now, with the event of there being the day of Monday, this particular date, and so on. But later events also exist on an eternalist static block. So the fact that those events already exist because they are causally necessitated by things that by earlier events and also events that are later than those later events, then it would seem that from this ontological status of events, I lack the ability to do otherwise. I mean, if the baked cake already exists on a later time slice, then I could ask myself if I can refrain from making that from baking that cake, right? Okay, so as Joseph de Kemper coined the term ontological fatalism because he wanted to make a difference between ontological fatalism and logical fatalism. Logical fatalism being the idea that fatalism, meaning that uh, any action of mine is unavoidable, or any future action of mine is unavoidable and fixed. Logical fatalism stems from the unrestricted application of the principle of bivalence. Bivalence being the idea that any proposition, any declarative proposition, is either true or false. But ontological fatalism is different. It does not necessarily require the principle of bivalence. Ontological fatalism is fatalism that stems from the idea that future events or later events already exist eternally. Okay, so De Campo writes, if, however, we are considering the variety of ontological fatalism that is meant to follow from a temporal eternalism, whereby all events exist eternally, and fixity is grounded in ontology, then it is plausible that the fixity of the future both implies and is a consequence of this variety of fatalism. Thus, as future events exist just the same as present or past events, it seems that future events are just as fixed as present or past events. Usually, the idea of fatalism is that the future is fixed, that there is nothing I can do to, well, alter the future, right? Or change the future from how it is fated to be, right? Nobody would say that I can change the past right now. So why claim that I can change the future? This is the basic idea of fatalism, right? Okay, so sorry, how am I doing with time right now? Sorry to
You're doing
ask.
beautifully, Bogdan. This is just terrific.
Oh, thank you. Because I ask this because I do not see the time right now because I have the presentation
Right.
right
So
now on full screen.
it's 6:51.
Oh, okay, okay. Then we will wrap up shortly in like 15 minutes or so. Okay, so what would be my comments on Hoffer's perspective? So Hoffer seems to be describing the growing block theory when he presents the A theory of time as posing a threat for free will. This particular A theory is very specific and can hardly be said to be the common sense view of time. This is what I say. Because it's not clear that our common sense intuition of time is that, well, the future is open and that the past is fixed. Not necessarily. But our common sense of view of time is actually presentism, which is a variation of the A theory of time. So already, right off the bat, Hoffer's characterization of the issue is a bit problematic. Um, for specificity, for uh, for clarity's sake, maybe he should have said that, well, eternalism has actually advantages over the growing block theory with regards to compatibility with free will, right? Okay, so Hoffer's inside-out perspective is essentially an eternalist B theory of time. Hoefer does not seem to avoid the worry that eternalism and free will are incompatible. This worry is the idea that if eternalism holds true, then ontological fatalism follows. Of course, his account may make freedom compatible with determinism, but this isn't enough to escape fatalism, I argue. Even if my actions need not be necessitated by past events plus the laws, no more than they would be necessitated by subsequent events plus the laws, then I could still lack the ability to do otherwise than to vote for President X, let's say, if the event that I vote for President X exists in a later time slice relative to me. Again, the forking road analogy creeps in. So the forking road analogy is just the analogy that we can use, let's say, on the growing block theory of time, in which, let's say, the road, the road that I just traversed is the fixed past, and well, I reach a point, which is the present, in which the road contains alternative routes, right? So those alternative routes would be the future in case the future is open, right? So someone who is a libertarian over here, someone who thinks that free will exists and that all agents have free will and that free will is the ability to do otherwise, should say that this forking road analogy must hold in order for libertarianism to be true, meaning that the future must be open and that the universe, that the correct theory of time is not eternalism, because eternalism has no branching, non-actual futures, right? It's a single branch on the eternalist theory of time. So there's no such thing as a forking road. There is only one road I can traverse, and only one. Okay. So it seems that I am right now on the road to baking that cake that I intend to bake for tomorrow. And there's no alternative road on the eternalist theory of time that I can take in order to avoid baking that cake, right? Okay, so Huffer's account, this is my third observation. Huffer's account needs to give us a positive account of metaphysical freedom. This objection was also stated in a more indirect way by Jason Brennan. But I ask, how could I be free as a fundamental determiner in the block universe? How is my ability to do otherwise or my bringing about of an event into existence secured? Free will could be either bring about events into existence. So I can bring into existence a cake, and we generally think that the cake does not exist at later times than my baking of the cake or before I even decide to bake the cake. Therefore, I might think I have existential control, as Shanks from 1990, in a 1994 article remarked. Or free will could be the ability to do otherwise, as I said in the beginning of the talk, or dual ability, as it's called in the free will literature. What I do and what I am able to do are not the same. If determinism and eternalism are correct, then what I do and what I am able to do are the same. They coincide. This is something that Peter van Inwagen would say. So if I bake that cake tomorrow, then obviously I do that, but it's also the only thing I can do. Okay, so so let's say I had eggs for breakfast, but I could have decided to have something else instead. That would be the ability to do otherwise. I could have done differently than I have done. Okay, the road analogy shows up again, unfortunately, because the road analogy also has some presuppositions about causation that are very controversial, and obviously brings in this whole debate about which metaphysical theory of time is the best, and so on. So that's why the road analogy is very problematic in in the free will debate. Okay, um, here are some problems that Hoffer's account has in relation to securing free will. So I say that because on an eternalist B theory we have an ontological symmetry regarding events, no difference in realness between earlier, simultaneous, or later events, nothing can be said to be brought into existence. We can admit that earlier events causally necessitate later events, but agents cannot bring events or objects into existence in the way in which, say, on an A-theory of time, they can. This was mostly inspired by Robin Le Podevon's article from 2013. Okay, more on this. If the B theory is true, then there can be no existential control because the apple pie, if it exists, exists as a C changeless, four-dimensional object in an appropriate region of space-time. Uh, the term sea change here is a term that is used by Shanks, by Mr. Shanks in 1994. Sea change here just means bringing about an event into existence, something that is possible only on an A theory of time, in which we have the dynamic thesis. Dynamicity being the idea that existence is relative to time, right? It seems that only on 8 years of time I can bring things into existence. Nothing really gets brought into existence on a B eternalist theory of time. Okay, so another observation on Hoffer would be that it might be true that my present actions probably determine or explain earlier or later states within the black universe. This is Hoffer's thesis, right? So the fact that my baked cake exists at a later time than T2 is contingent on my baking the cake at T1. No doubt that my baking of the cake determines and explains the existence of the cake located at the later time T2. However, under the assumption of eternally existing events, I could ask myself, if my cake exists at T2, do I have a choice as to whether I am able to refrain from baking the cake or not? This is, well, obviously the question that it's aimed at Hoffer's inside out block universe perspective. So if my cake exists at T2, do I have a choice as to whether I am able to refrain from baking the cake or not? I can be a fundamental determiner of the existence of the cake all day long. My actions of my deliberations, my uh, making by my baking of the cake obviously determine the appearance of the cake at T2, and they determine, well, the existence of it and also explain why it exists. Obviously, I can be a fundamental determiner, but if it already exists as a later time slice, as it does in the block universe, then do I really have a choice as to whether I'm able to refrain from baking the cake or not? Now, obviously, somebody like James Van Cleef, like Mr. James Van Cleef in 2018, could say that this is sort of a model fallacy. A model fallacy would be a conflating of the necessity of the consequence with the necessity of the consequent, being something like, let's say, premise one, P, premise two, necessarily P implies Q, then conclusion is necessarily Q. Obviously, this is a fallacy. Okay, however, I do not think that this is an instance of the model fallacy for two reasons. We are not talking about logical fatalism, the type of fatalism that arises out of the unrestricted application of the principle of equivalence, but about ontological fatalism. Under the assumption of ontological fatalism, we already assume that for every x, if x is an event, then x exists eternally. This is not to say that the cake will necessarily sprout into existence by some other causal chain if I choose not to bake it, but baking that my baking it is already causally necessitated by earlier and later events, and is thus the only possible event at that particular time slice. The appearance, the existence of the cake at T2 is obviously explained by my baking it at T1, right? Okay, but a certain author like Nathan Oaklander, a very, very prominent philosopher of time, is not impressed by this line of thinking, by this fatalist line of thinking. He says that it is not at all clear, however, that the existence of an eternal fact necessitates anything. The necessity does not follow from the principle of bivalence. If I vote for Gore in 2000, then my present statement in 1996, I will vote for Gore in 2000, is true. And if I do not vote for him, then my present statement, I will not vote for Gore in 2000, is true. In other words, it is my later decision that determines which of two contradictory statements about the future is true, since it is my later decision that determines which eternal fact exists. Now, I'm not convinced by Oaklander's objection here to this fatalist line of thinking, because I still think that right here Oaklander conflates logical determinism with logical fatalism with ontological fatalism. He still thinks that the source of fatalism here is the principle of ambivalence. But this is not so, because right here in this reason, I did not say anything about the principle of ambivalence. The idea of ontological fatalism, as coined by Joseph D. Camper in 2007, is that the source of fatalism in this eternalist framework is the fact that later events later than the event I am simultaneous with right now, already exist, right? All right. So this is well not a conclusion to this whole talk, because this is well a research that is in progress and is very much a work in progress right now, and a very rough work in progress, meaning that uh, it's nowhere near its final result, its completion. But I can only add this for now, that Hoffer's insight is undoubtedly interesting into the problem of free will and its relationship with the philosophy of time, and brings an opportunity for new discussions to be had in the field of the philosophy of time. This analysis of the relation between free will and the metaphysical theories of time brings my current research closer to answering the question, well, what theory of time is free will compatible with? Okay, and these are the sources.
Thank you so much, Bogdan. This has been incredibly informative and thought-provoking. I should like to say I very much enjoyed your talk and am looking forward to the questions that our colleagues are going to raise for sure. Um, just a word of warning. Um, any kind of questions are welcome in any kind of format. If any of you would prefer to ask questions in French, German, Romanian, or perhaps other languages, that's perfectly fine, limited to our ability to translate them. Or, you know, if they're in Romanian for sure, to be able to address them directly. Let me just very quickly issue an invitation to everyone to sign up for questions for Bogdan in the chat. And meanwhile, I should say this has been quite interesting, and I'm sure our colleagues are going to have a bunch of questions to ask you, Bogdan.
Thanks a lot, Andre. And I am quite surprised that I only had like that I only că am depășit cu 6 minute. Doar only with 6 minutes.
Right. So also, I should say, so thanks for that. I should say, if any and all of you would rather prefer that, would feel more at ease and more comfortable and happier, if we ended the recording and had a Q&A that was in some sense free of any further evidence-based documentation into it. By all means, please make that known, because we'd like everyone to be fully at ease with these recordings. Okay, so do we have a first question?
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Bogdan, I want to ask you, regardless of the outcome of your thesis, right now, at the present moment, which of the two theories do you prefer and why?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because, well, and thank you for the question, obviously. Well, I am very much in favor of eternalism, right now. And I do this because, well, one could get very influenced by and convinced of the veracity of eternalism by reading a bit more about the theory of special relativity. I mean, authors like Bertrand Russell and Quine and J.J.C. Smart, and also Hilary Putnam, also when defending eternalism, they they point out to the theory of special relativity, meaning that absolute simultaneity of events is incompatible with an objective privileged present, right? Meaning that depending on our frame of reference, well, my present is different than yours, meaning that within my frame of reference, an event can be in your future and also be in my past, right? The same event. That should be like a rough consequence of the theory of special relativity. And the J.J.C. Smart and Hilary Putnam, well, have put forward this argument in favor of eternalism. So there are quite powerful arguments in favor of uh, at least a minimal version of eternalism that doesn't really restrict the existence of events to presently existing events, or the idea that there is no such thing as a privileged present, because special relativity has shown us these consequences that an event can be in your future relative to your frame of reference, and in my past relative to my frame of reference. So I hope that answers your question.
Right. So thanks so much for that. I just can't help myself, and I'm going to ask a quick follow-up to Mrs. Nagu's question. Suppose that an event is in my future and in your past, right? That's the scenario envisaged here. How is that an argument for eternalism? How is that, for instance, not equally an argument for some kind of relationist, idealist, subject perspective dependent sort of moving spotlight view?
It can definitely be compatible with the moving spotlight view, because the moving spotlight is also an eternalist theory. Just that on this eternalist theory, we add an objective present. It's like an ordering of events, and we just highlight one event with a spotlight.
Right, but well, I mean, it's a mixed view. But suppose you added the writer that an instant exists to the extent that it's lighted, right? So in as much as it's not, as light isn't shown upon it, it's not real, right?
Well, I think that would collapse into just a version of presentism, mostly.
Well, not exactly, because suppose you have flashbacks, right? And then the moving spotlight is on something in your past. And so it's not presentism, right? It's pastism, if you like.
Right. It would seem more like it's a sort of growing block theory, or actually, no, it's still a moving spotlight theory. You're right.
It's a tricky view, yeah.
Yes, it's still a moving spotlight theory. You're right. And well, many variations of the spotlight theory have been put by Rose Cameron and Bradford Scow. I don't remember his middle name.
Exactly right. Yeah.
But yes, Mr. Scow does have a moving spotlight theory. And sure. As to your initial question, how is this an argument for eternalism? Well, Smart would say something like this. So suppose we have two philosophers. One philosopher is an anti-realist about the future, thinks that the future is unreal and is an open futurist. And the other is an eternalist. Well, suppose they are on two moving spaceships and they witness the same event. And according to special relativity, well, this event, let's say, would be in the anti-realist philosopher's future, and in the realist philosopher's past, let's say. Well, that would mean that when they talk to each other on the phone, this guy, the anti-realist, would say that that event does not yet exist, right? Although it's already in the past frame of reference, and although it's already in the frame reference of the other individual, the realist individual. So they would disagree, right? One would say that no, this flash of light is real, and the other, who is an anti-realist, would say no, it's unreal.
Well, to the extent that they would be asserting the existence of temporal events that are not perspective relative, they would disagree. Yeah. But if they wouldn't, then they wouldn't. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
True.
Something like that.
True.
Awesome. So, so much for your question. Could you possibly phrase it for all of us?
Okay, so what I'm trying to understand is what exactly counts as a presentist theory. My first intuition was that the A series meant presentist theory and the B series meant an eternalist one. But I'm a little confused now. I'm asking, is an A dynamic theory the only theory that counts truly presentist one?
Yes, I would say that, well, okay, so we have these multitude of theories that actually are under the umbrella called A theory, right? And presentism is one of them. So the idea in presentism is simply that only present events exist. There are no such thing as past events existing now and no such thing as future events existing now. Also, it wouldn't really make sense to speak of uh, propositions being already true, future propositions being already true on presentism. But this problem would also be towards the past, because the past is unreal also on a presentist view. So we have these quantifiers. On a presentist view, the quantifier of existing things, or the domain of existing things, is restricted to the present moment, right? On an eternalist, no, there's unrestricted quantification. Uh, okay, there was another part to your question, Andre, I believe, or was it not?
Um, I asked if a static AC theory counts as an eternalist theory. If I remember
Oh,
correctly,
the static one.
the astatic means the spotlight.
Yes. So astatic, yes, is the moving spotlight theory. Well, it doesn't really count as a presentist theory, although it does postulate the existence of an objective present, like any A theory does, but it's not a presentist theory because presentists just say that, well, only present events exist, and clearly on the moving spotlight theory, also past events have a sort of existence, and future events have this sort of existence, right? So existence is not dynamic over there on the moving spotlight theory, or at least on the versions of moving spotlight theory that I'm acquainted with, because, well, there's a big literature on moving spotlight theory. So I hope it answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much,
You're welcome.
Andre. And I must confess, this is a really interesting question. I'm very puzzled about it, but what Bogdan said did help alleviate that a bit. I'm wondering if there are other questions. I'm eager to jump in and ask some questions of my own, but I don't want to cut anybody off. If there are other questions before I start asking some of mine, that'd be terrific. If not, let me, Bogdan, as I invite our colleagues to ask some more questions in the chat, let me just ask one of my own. And this is going to be incredibly simple-minded, okay? So maybe this is old-fashioned. Maybe this is just an orthodoxy of sorts, right? But so you've mentioned a couple of logical models of time. You've mentioned some physical concepts such as Well, you've mentioned quite a few of them. And obviously, we also might think of, say, historical representations of time, where clearly the past and the future are quite dissimilar, hopefully. And it would initially seem, I would contend, that we wouldn't want different levels of analysis and representations of time at these different levels of analysis to in any way prejudge the issue of free will or the issues of free will. Perhaps there are several of them connected. And if so, I'm just wondering if there's some elbow room between some of the views that you've put on offer here. So, for instance, just to take a random example, you've mentioned that branching times, right, make room for free choice or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So why would that be? Wouldn't it be possible for time to branch, say, if nature is indeterministic, but still the sorts of natural events that subtend our decisions be themselves determined, so that you would have branching time, but you wouldn't have free will? So it seems as though there's enough sort of wiggle room there to afford conceptions like that. Now, maybe those aren't interesting, and so I don't know. Is there some kind of easy answer to this? Or?
Well, as far as I know, there's definitely not at all an easy answer to this. The easiest, most academic answer would be that it's complicated, because as I mentioned, that the road analogy creeped in a number of times during the talk. Yes, this road analogy is very intuitive, but at the same time it's very problematic, because the road analogy comes with its own packages of presuppositions. And as you very well mentioned, the problem of indeterminism. Okay, so let's have a branching theory of time in which we have a present that peers into some possible roads, some possible alternate routes. And so if the actual past plus the laws entail multiple possible futures, then indeterminism holds in that world. All right. Well, surely simply the presence of indeterminism, simply the truth of the thesis of indeterminism, doesn't secure free will, because one could obviously come, like Peter van Inwagen would say, and ask us to think, well, okay, let's replay your moment of deciding whether to bake the cake or not. Let's replay it for an infinite amount of times, or not really infinite, let's say 100 times. Well, what would you say? And how many possible branches did you actually bake the cake? And then how many possible branches did you actually not bake the cake? And we would be tempted to say 50-50. And if we say 50-50, then it seems that under determinism, our choice is a matter of chance, if it's just 50-50. This is Peter van Inwagen's argument in a very later work of his. This was an argument against, well, the idea that agent causation would give us free will, would secure free will. So yeah, this is a complicated issue, and the road analogy, while it is very explanatory, it carries with it some implicit assumptions that are actually controversial, not and not set in stone. Simply this idea that indeterminacy is needed or is a sufficient condition for the security of free will, and it's definitely not, as we see, because indeterminism can entail that our actions are just a matter of chances.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, well, I'm not sure about that last bit, but I'm wondering. Clearly, free will here isn't bound to be understood on the model of being able to having been able to do otherwise, right? Clearly, we should be able to be deemed to have free will and some of our choices, irrespective of whether we did have that ability to do otherwise or not, right? I guess a priori there doesn't seem to be any kind of logical entailment, as you rightly pointed out, with the road analogy between, say, graphic models of time and our ability, our freedom or our respective lack of it, right? Because, to put it crudely, models of time say nothing about agents, right?
Right, and that's actually one of the chief objections that, well, Jason Brennan indirectly stated. I mean, he didn't say it directly, but from his basic talking points, from his basic premises, this is actually a line of criticism that, okay, the metaphysics of time doesn't necessarily say anything about the causality of agents or what kind of objects are agents in this framework. And this is a part that Huffer didn't really talk about in his programmatic article. So yeah, a that is an objection to Hoffer,
Right.
that I agree with, that it is an objection.
Awesome. So it's terrific. I circled back to agreeing with your criticism of Hoffer. I believe we have a new question from Radu. Radu, we're all ears.
Hi, hello. I'm thinking about the case that there is no free will. So if there is no free will, can we, or let's say the guys who adhere to, who take this view, how can it be accounted for that thing that it seems to be free will? It seems to be decision. So when we think that we make a decision, what would that be? Is it?
All right. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. And well, I think it's a very important one, a very important clarificatory question, because, well, my answer would be this. If I'm a determinist, if I'm a radical determinist, okay, I don't exclude the actual process of deliberation that I might have. But what I might think of the process of deliberation, of actually deciding to do something, deciding to bake the cake or not bake the cake, I may think that this process is causally necessitated by antecedent events, by, let's say, prior thoughts, prior memories, intentions, and so far. And that this line, this causal chain, reaches back, let's say, to my birth. And if we extrapolate and say that these causal necessitations hold between time slices, let's say, well, those time slices reach to the initial conditions of the universe. So if I'm a radical determinist, let's say, and I believe in causal determinism, well, then it seems that from the first time slice of the universe, from the initial conditions of the universe, there is a uninterrupted causal chain from that initial time slice to me, to my baking of the cake, to my deciding to bake the cake or not. So, sure, when I deliberate, I might think that I have free will. I might think that I have that I can do otherwise. But on the radical deterministic view, I actually don't have the ability to do otherwise, or to refrain, or to do otherwise than how I will do. Right. I hope that this clarifies it.
How does this stand if I do an experiment like this one? So I toss a coin for 20 tosses 20 times, and then I come up with a rule. So if it's heads, I raise my left hand, or if it's tails, the right one, and then I executed the series. So I have two chains of causality that stretches from Big Bang to the present. One is for that coin to come up heads or tails in a sequence of tosses, and then I execute them. So I have to have another chain of causality that ends up with the same with a correlation between my execution of the of the commands and the randomness, the what appears to be a random results, a random occurrence in the results of the coin tosses.
Right. Well, I think that the determinist, the radical one, would simply say that it's actually the same causal chain. It's actually a single chain over here. I mean, he would say that the coin tosses are all part of a single sequence of events, just like the events like that are relative to me, whatever events are happening in the world, and whatever my thoughts are. Well, those are part of a single, big, global, universal causal chain of events. Let's say. I think that that's how the determinist would respond over here, because he would probably take a God's eye view and probably view all of this as an eternalist block universe, let's say. So if we look at with the God's eye view to that block universe, there don't seem to be random occurrences, at least not prima facie. There does seem to be a single way that things can go, right? Well, sure, this answer might not seem satisfactory right now, but in any case, it's a very interesting question that you raised.
All right, thanks so much, Galu, and thanks so much, Bogdan, for the answer. Next, we have a question from Andrei Ionescu concerning what's happening now, right? What's going on now?
So I was asking, what does the word now mean on an eternalist model? So if the past, the present, the future all exist in a way simultaneously on the 4D block, what does now refer to?
Great question. That is,
maybe. No,
yes, you
I
wanted
was
to.
thinking maybe you are traveling through the block or something. I'm still a little confused.
No, no. So the idea on an eternalist view is that now is simply an indexical. Now is simply, or the present is simply the my state of consciousness that is simultaneous with, well, Wednesday, 7:31 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So yeah, it would be my state of consciousness, my awareness, that is simultaneous with the event that I am in right now. So now is just simply an indexical on an eternalist framework, because on A theories, now is a property of an event. It's an objective property. There is an objective privileged present on A theories. And on eternalism, we don't have that. Now is simply an indexical. Now is different in extension, not an intention when I utter it, and it's different in extension when you utter it, when you say now. Uh, let's say this is a consequence of special relativity, right?
So how does time flow for me? For me, the subjective self who perceives this flow of time. Why am I not stuck in a moment of time? That's what confuses me.
Right. Well, obviously, from an objective point of view, eternalists say that there's no such thing as passage of time. There's no such thing as flow of time, because flow of time is secured by an objective now that moves along the events. If we're on a moving spotlight theory, or if we're on a growing block theory, now is simply the adding of new time slices to the block. Let's say. And okay, so how does the B theorist explain my flowing perception of time, right? This is your question. Well, this is obviously an
Exactly.
objection to the eternalist view. And the eternalist views quite often, well, there is literature on this topic that eternalists try to answer this objection. Well, they come up with explanations of an evolutionary sense. It's just evolutionary let's say evolutionary useful for me to have this perception of time or something like that. They go back to causal evolutionary explanations of why I have this perception of time. This perception of time as a nunc-fluens, as a flowing thing. And right, so obviously this is a point. This is a very good point, Andre. This is the point in which the eternalist owes us an explanation for our for our perception of a flowing time. Why does it seem like time flows if time, objectively speaking, is just a static block, like eternalists say? Right. I wanted to add something more here. I wanted to say that also this discussion is also reflected in some writings by the great and famous logician Arthur Prior. So Arthur Prior, who was an atheist mostly, said that, well, this temporal talk of the eternalist theorists that say that, well, if I utter the statement, I am sitting now, this is a statement that is incomplete because I must insert a date at which I am sitting, which would make the proposition either eternally true or eternally false. He said that, okay, but Prior said that, okay, this tenseless talk isn't applicable to all sorts of propositions, to every kind of proposition, because let's consider the proposition, I'm glad that's over. Let's say, oh, I'm glad this class is over, or I'm glad this headache is over. Well, it's not the case that this tensed sentence can be reduced to a tenseless sentence, says Prior, because it's not the case that I'm glad that this headache finished at, let's say, 7:35 Monday, right? And I'm not glad because it finished on a certain date. I'm glad that it's over with. I'm glad that it has passed, right? So this would be Prior's example of an irreducibility of tense talk to tenseless sentences. So yeah, again, the problem of now, the problem of how we semantically interpret now and why we perceive nowness is obviously an area in which the B theorists owes us explanations, right? Sorry for being long there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andrei, for the question and Bogdan for the answer. I'm wondering if there are some new questions or comments or interventions of various sorts.
Just wanted. I had a question. I'm just passed through my mind now.
Please go ahead.
If we take time out of all the equations and the physical laws, how we deal with everything? Because maybe it's just something we need from an evolutionary point of view, but we build everything around it. So I was thinking, there is any theory about if we take time out of our life, what would we put instead of it?
Right. Well, the Eternalists would say exactly that. The Eternalists would say, okay, so this perception of time, the fact that we think that the time is something that is moving, and we construct clocks and all of that stuff, is just an evolutionary adaptation. That's the explanation route, the explanatory route that the Eternalists can go to. That's the move he can make. That's the move that is available to him. But obviously, this might come at a certain price, right? it might seem that okay, if we just say that time is not flowing, then what kind of explanation would be the best in order to explain why we have this perception of time? But surely the fact that we perceive time, the fact that we have this perception of time as a flowing now, is is real. This illusion is real, right? So to the B theorist, this doesn't correspond to a feature of reality, but it's nonetheless our perception, and we build and construct things around this perception because there is no other way to do so. And the A theorist would say, no, no, this flow of time is real. It might be subjective many to many agents, but time as a physical thing actually flows, right? So I don't know if it clarified anything to your question.
Yeah, it actually did because I was thinking about we have to work with our perceptions. I was thinking about the how we see in the mirror. We perceive we see the things opposite, but actually the mirror doesn't change anything. It's the light reflecting back that gives us this illusion. So we build things around this illusion just to make our life work. Probably time is something we need to make things work. We have
Right,
to keep this
right,
perception. Yeah.
right. As a final point, and I won't be long here, to the Eternalists, the time in which we live our lives is simply perspectival, right? And it doesn't need to correspond to a feature of time itself. So we have this difference surely between appearance and reality here that pops up again, like it always pops up in philosophy. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Igina, and lots of things to say about that. That's an incredibly interesting and exciting view. But maybe we'll come back to that in conversation. Meanwhile, we have Andrei Paraskiv. Andrei, we're all ears.
Yes, thank you. My question is, what exactly is our aim here? Because earlier, when we were asked about what your views are, Bogdan, you talked about eternalism because it fits well with current theories in relativistic physics, for example.
Yeah,
But
contemporaneous physics. Yeah. Mhm.
what fits well with contemporary physics does not really fit well with our phenomenological subjective experience intuitions, as my colleagues pointed out earlier. So what would be considered an advantage for a theory of time? For example, does the eternalist view not overload the ontological landscape a little too much? Does that not sabotage us rather than help us?
All right. So then, obviously, there is a tension between our common sense of view of time and this and what the eternalist proposes. Sure. Yeah, and obviously, physicists who will talk about relativistic physics and quantum mechanics and all that stuff would say that, of course, the consequences of these theories are unintuitive for us because we are, well, let's say, corrupted by our perception of things. So yeah, there is a tension between our intuitive views of things like time, like causality, like the self, or all of that, and with what the physics say. Okay, so you ask what would be the advantage of an eternalist theory, and it isn't the eternalist theory putting us at a disadvantage by overloading, let's say, the ontological landscape? Well, sure, but I don't think it's problematic. I don't think this inflation of ontology is problematic because it's not that we can think like a Meinongian and say that we have being or subsistence for, let's say, logically impossible entities or fictional entities, let's say. So what exists on an eternalist landscape are just the events that actually happened in the world, or well, sure. Well, notice the temporal talk, notice the tense talk that is present in our vocabulary. I said things that happened. Well, things don't really happen. Events don't really happen on an eternalist framework, right? If they all exist. We can talk about only earlier, simultaneous with, or later states there. So yeah, as a first intuition, I don't think it's necessarily problematic because all of these events in a block universe are well harmonious with each other. They don't produce, let's say, I don't know, contradictions between each other. It's not the case that on this framework, on an eternalist framework, I bake the cake and I also not bake the cake. No, I either do that or I do not. That's why the Eternalist framework is also very, very compatible with, let's say, the principle of bivalence. Because if later states exist, then those later events can act as facts and in turn can act as truth makers for future tense propositions, right? And that's why the eternalism seems to favor fatalism, right? Okay, so you ask what is the advantage of the eternalist theory? Well, the advantage here is that we don't have to explain a privileged present, which is a bit weird to try to, well, a bit controversial, or it's not really sure how, uh, let's say, how defensible the idea that there exists such an objective privilege present right now, given the fact that we also have special relativity and all of that. So that would be an advantage of the eternalist theory, that we don't have to deal with an objective present. We can explain the present by saying that it's an indexical, and it works that way in our language, and that the present is a mental state that is simultaneous with the events that is simultaneous with my mental state, right? So this has these advantages. It's a bit compatible with contemporary physics, and it's also, let's say, there are many explanations available to why we think that there is such a thing as an objective present, that it's all like perspectival regarding the now. So I don't know if we clarified a bit or if I was too obscure or too long there. So I hope my answer helped a bit. You're welcome.
Thanks so much to Andrei Pagaskip for the question and to Bogdan for the answer. Bogdan, I believe you have a nemesis, Andrei Ionescu, and he will ask another question for you. And by all means, I'm very grateful for the exchange. And meanwhile, if some of the other participants in our conversation, Andrei Pagaskip, Bogdan, Irina, Andrea or someone else would like to jump in, by all means, please go ahead, phrase your questions, and we'll get to them in a second. Thanks so much. Andrea, you're up next.
Thank you very much. So, what I'm trying to wrap my head around is this idea of a sort of non-temporal causality. So, if on an eternalist model things don't really happen, I don't really get what causality means anymore. I'm really
and this is exactly Jason Brennan's criticism of Huffer's perspective, right? And well, it's not just his, but it's also Robin Lepodovan's criticism of eternalists, him being mostly an eternalist himself, because from what I know, Podovan is actually a moving spotlight theorist, so he is a type of eternalist. So yeah, so causation is unidirectional, let's say. It's asymmetric. It only goes to, let's say, earlier states to later states. Okay, so how do we explain causality on an eternalist viewpoint? Well, one could say that actually causality is just a series of correlations, just a series of patterns over here. It's just like we see a road, right? We see a road and we see that it's connected with a lot of villages and a lot of stuff, and it's uninterrupted, right? There's no flow, right? We can't speak of a road as flowing, right? Nothing flows on the road. Let's say there aren't any cars on it. but the road has a direction, right? And this seems to be actually why the B theory is a theory of time, not a theory of space, because it has a privileged direction from earlier to later. This is actually a different issue, the problem of the direction of time. So the B theorist wants to keep the direction of time, which is the direction of causality. Well, some authors would say that the direction of time reduces itself to the direction of causality, because causality is one directional. That is what David Miller would say, another B theorist. So yeah, it would be like that. It wouldn't bring things into existence, let's say, like on an A theory, but it would be a thing that has a direction, just like a road has a direction, just like the direction of time is a direction, right? Earlier to later. Sure. I mean, somebody would ask, okay, but why is this direction? How is this direction possible, and how is this direction explainable on eternalist theory, right? And so one can answer, the answer that Huffer gives, that Miller gives, is, well, this is simply a consequence of the law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy increases, never decreases, or something like that. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Thank
sorry.
you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Radu, we have another question. Please go ahead.
Aș putea cere permisiunea să vorbesc în română, pentru că dacă e ceva la care sunt mai slab decât filozofia e engleză.
Nici o problemă. În orice limbi sunt vorbite între noi.
Ok. Suntem toți înțelegători de română, nu? În listă. Așa. Există un argument în favoarea faptului că nu neapărat timpul are o direcție de curs, cât noi îl putem observa doar în această direcție, pentru că sistemele de memorie pot fi modelate doar în prezența unei eliminării de căldură, iar asta presupune entropie crescătoare. Drept pentru care faptul că noi vedem sensul timpului legat de sensul de creștere al entropiei este datorită faptului că memoria care ar trebui să stea la baza unui organism conștient, nu? Memoria poate pluti doar deasupra unei conștiința poate pluti, să zicem, poate să apară emergent doar deasupra unui sistem de memorie, în biologic în cazul nostru. Sistemul ăsta de memorie este prins doar pe această etalare în secvența asta a frame-urilor, să spunem. Ceea ce însă îmi pare mie că e o distinție care trebuie investigată mai mult este cea între cauzalitatea evenimentelor de tip natural și cea a evenimentelor de tip, să zicem, intervenția minții asupra materiei în organisme, și văzut dacă aceasta este totuși un alt caz sau nu este un alt caz față de fenomenele din lumea naturii. Adică avem un Geist și un natur, sau avem doar natur și Geist este un caz special care presupune niște iluzii, cum ar fi iluzia deciziilor.
Chiar Hoefer, da.
Are mult esprit finesse în întrebarea ta. Dacă e posibil, Bogdan, dacă dorești să răspunzi în românește, foarte bine. Dacă ai dori să răspunzi în englezește, rugămintea este să recapitulezi foarte pe scurt cum ai receptat întrebarea lui Radu, pentru oricine ne-ar putea urmări, da?
Bun. Întrebarea ar fi, bun, există direcție în timp care este dată de direcția legii a doua termodinamice.
Scuze, da.
Poftim? Scuze, n-am auzit, Andrei.
Mă gândeam doar dacă îți dorești să răspunzi în englezește. Dacă răspunzi în românește, am auzit
întrebarea a fost în română, răspunsul va fi în română.
Okay.
Bun, dar întrebarea este dacă cauzalitatea între evenimente este aceeași precum cauzalitatea între agent și evenimente. Cred că asta era, de fapt, întrebarea. Că, bun, dacă există o vreo diferență între, să zicem, faptul că eu cauzez ceva și faptul că, să zicem, doi copaci se ciocnesc când cad. Da? Dacă este vreo diferență de natură în această relație. Ei bine, sigur că aici am putea să intrăm într-un soi de idealism și chiar Hoefer are un soi de idealism la finalul articolului său, în care spune că agenții în eternalism sunt liberi pentru că sunt agenți, nu pentru că sunt evenimente. În sensul că acest agent ar putea să fie cauza sui, ar putea să fie cauzatori necauzați ale propriilor lor acțiuni. Dar sigur că asta este o direcție mai problematică care ține de ontologia agentului și care nu are treabă cu teoria asupra timpului. Da? Și sigur că dacă Hoefer vrea să aducă în prim plan ideea asta, cum că noi nu suntem conglomerate de evenimente, ci suntem agenți și putem fi cauza sui și putem fi cauzatorii acțiunilor noastre prin prisma voințelor noastre, care nu sunt reductibile la cauze antecedente dinaintea acțiunilor noastre, let's say, atunci el vine cu o ontologie diferită și nu este clar dacă cumva ontologia asta nu e ea însă soluția pentru liber arbitru și perspectiva sa asupra eternalismului este superfluă, e irelevantă. Asta este în mare parte și critica lui Brennan asupra lui Hoefer.
Ok, mulțumim foarte mult. Eram curios cum preferați, putem continua în românește sau putem să o dăm pe englezește din nou pentru eventualii noștri ascultători. So thanks so much, Gadu, for your question. I was just wondering, there seemed to be another side to Gadu's question, and that seemed to concern the relationship between memory and entropy and, or as it were, pre-theoretical representations, temporal representations, and of course, that seems to mix several levels of explanation and analysis, but, well, so does the big wide world. And then, right, the question is, well, how are we going to distinguish the nature of time and the nature of instance, metaphysically speaking, from all of these levels? And so, Bogdan, if you wanted to expand on that very briefly as well, that would have been terrific.
Well, sure. These are many asymmetries that are present. So, for example, David Lewis talks about these many asymmetries, and obviously not only him. There's a big literature on these types of asymmetries and how they can be accounted for. And some accounts are compatible with eternalism, and some are not. Like David Lewis is a sort of eternalist on the plurality of words. He is a sort of eternalist there. What he says is that, let's say, this asymmetry of causation and the asymmetry of memory and the asymmetry of causal action, meaning that my actions have effects only to the future, never towards the past, and so on, and the asymmetry of memory, obviously. Well, these are due to an asymmetry of counterfactual dependence. So Lewis would, reduce this to the asymmetry of counterfactuals. So it's clear that if the past had been different, then right now, the present moment would be different. And not the other way around, not necessarily. That's what Mr. Lewis would say. So there is this counterfactual explanation that seems to be available for the eternalist, but this kind of gets defeated when Huffer introduces the idea of bidirectional determinism. Because if he introduces bidirectional determinism, it says that, well, events in the block determine both earlier states and later states, or can explain them, then the counterfactual asymmetry kind of seems like counterfactual symmetry over here when Huffer introduces bidirectional determinism, or at least this is how I see it. I may say I might have something extremely stupid, but this is how I see Huffer's This is how I see a consequence of Hoffer's perspective.
Thank you so much, Bogdan. And this was incredibly instructive for me because there's so many. Well, you know, once you get into the thicket of it, there's so much conceptual legwork that one can do, and this is incredibly informative. I'm just wondering if there are some other questions that are maybe in the offing, and if so, that'd be fantastic. Please be mindful that we've already abused our speaker for 2 hours. And so, if there very briefly 1 or 2 more questions, and then we might come to a close for the night. So, anyone else? Okay, then I'm going to take the privilege to ask the last question, and this is obviously not going to be a fantastic one. So, Bogdan, please brace yourself. So I'm just wondering if there are some other. So it seemed to me, okay, this is the background, right? It seemed to me that you're trying to handshake 2 very different metaphysical views, right? One pertaining to the metaphysics of time, right, and one pertaining to the metaphysics of free will, right? And so one might wonder if we could sneak in some other metaphysical topics in between those 2, right? So for instance, suppose that you're a Humean about the nature of the self, right? Suppose that you think that being a self is being nothing but the scattered, as it were, conscious events that one goes through, right? And so, is there a problem there? Is there a problem for free will, or maybe to put what is a quite different question, but in some sense, in my mind at least, sort of connected, right? So suppose you're in the experience machine, right? You're in the experience machine, and everything that seems in the fiction that results to be up to you results exactly as you intended to, right? With the exception of things that you desire but somehow fall short of intending, right? Or some such. So would you count as having free will with respect to the machine or in the simulation that's being delivered to you, irrespective of how things stand in the big wide metaphysical world? Or is there some such need for the decision within the simulation to in some sense be primarily due to yourself as an agent, to in some sense be transcendent to the simulation in question, to in some sense be owing to you as opposed to, and I'm very eager to learn more about that opposed to, right? As opposed to the machine or something like that. So I'm wondering if you have some clear-headed answer to the very meandering and half-baked question I thought of spurting last. Thanks so much.
Well, I hope I can give a coherent answer here because, okay, we're in the experience machine and we're not in the real world, let's say. Okay, well, I think that, well, if I have free will, let's say in the real world, well, a condition for having free will in the experience machine, also simulation, would be if those effects, those results of my actions in the simulation, in the machine, are up to me or aren't just fed into me and I just think I am deliberating and deciding what to do and actually doing those things. So if I'm like in a sort of a video game, well, I don't think that when I make decisions in a video game, I don't really have a sort of decision to make there. It's not the case that if two possible routes are there in a game for me to take, then I don't have free will just because it's a simulation. And just because it's virtual and not the physical world. So I do think that if we just say that those effects are up to me, I can control them or not, I can make them obtain or make them not obtain, then I think we can have free will also in the experience machine. Now, regarding your question, can we smuggle some more metaphysical concepts in this huge discussion? Well, surely we can summon the discussion on personal identity, because as the literature would have it, in the philosophy of time, we have two theories of objects persisting through time: endurantism and perdurantism. And eternalists like David Lewis are perdurantists, which means that an object persists through times by having different temporal stages at different times, right? I am a temporally extended object in time, just like an object would be extended, let's say, on a street. Just like objects are extended in space, I'm extended in time due to my temporal states. That's what perdurantism says. So that's how eternalism would conceive of personal identity. It's just the causal connection between my temporal states that makes me me, right? Okay. Another part, just very, very briefly here, would be humanism about laws. Humanism about laws would be the idea that laws are contingent generalizations. They describe patterns and they don't necessitate things. They don't dictate how things ought to be in a closed system. They just describe how those patterns are. They just describe the movements of the particles. They're contingent generalizations. And humanism about laws and eternalism, as some authors would say, are natural allies here. So yeah, this is another area that is worth exploring.
All right, thank you so much, Bogdan. And I think I can't begin to express my gratitude for not only the very nice presentation, but also the extended conversation that followed suit. And I'm very grateful both to yourself and to our fellow audience members for quite a number of very provocative questions. And please stay tuned. Next week, our colleague Nicoleta Bartunek is going to talk to us about Wittgenstein and about, I believe, various differences between the early and the late Wittgenstein. An announcement is going to be distributed shortly. Thank you so much, Bogdan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the lively discussion. It was amazing.
Thanks so much. Take care. Good night and see you soon.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And have fun
Bye.
having your cake done.
Well done, Bogdan.